Victoria Hall was a typical bright, lively teenager. Her father described her as having been a happy, loving child. She spent hours on the phone to her best friend. She was studying for her A-levels. She had a part-time job and loved to go out dancing. For reasons only you know, and most people will never start to comprehend, you snatched her away and you crushed that young life. You are 67 years old. You are already serving a life sentence with a whole life order for 5 other murders of young women. The terms of imprisonment that I impose today will almost certainly make no difference. Nonetheless, my duty is to decide on the proper sentence, knowing as I do that no life sentence passed on you can ever heal the bereaved family's loss and grief. In the small hours of Saturday, the 18th of February 1999, in Felixstowe, Emily Doherty had been out clubbing, but ended up separated from her friends and her husband. So she set off to walk back to where she was staying. You tried to kidnap her, but she was too alert and too quick and escaped, managing to rouse a couple by banging on their front door, who then called the police. I am sure that if you had managed to abduct her, you would have killed her. That is a dreadful thing to conclude, but I do so based on what you did the next night, what you did in 2006, and on the simple fact that Miss Doherty had seen your face and your car's number plate. So there is no way you would have set her free to have you arrested. That same Saturday, the 18th of September, Victoria Hall went to her part-time job, then came home and got dressed up, ready to go out. She left her home in Trimley St Mary, just by Felixstowe, about 9 p.m, and met with her friend Gemma Alga. The two of them went to the Bandbox nightclub in Felixstowe. They had a drink, they danced with each other, and at 1 a.m. they left. They went and got chips near the seafront and then set off to walk home, singing as they went. They parted company quite close to their homes at about 2:20, and that was the last time anybody, apart from you, saw Victoria Hall alive. Miss Hall's naked body was found 5 days later in the village of Creeting St Peter, about 25 miles from her home. Expert evidence shows she must have been killed within an hour or two of being abducted by being asphyxiated. The fact she was naked and the later discovery of your DNA material in swabs taken from her vagina and vulva show you not only abducted and murdered that child, you also either raped or sexually assaulted her. I've heard today evidence from her brother Stephen Hall on behalf of himself and his father Graham. I've also heard from Miss Hall's best friend Gemma Alga and from Emily Doherty. Miss Doherty has been left with lifelong anxieties about walking after dark and being spoken to by any man she doesn't know, and by a sense of guilt, blaming herself absolutely wrongly for not being more insistent that the police at the time took her case more seriously. Gemma Alga spoke of being traumatised and changed for life. Graham and Stephen Hall spoke in simple, calm words that are hard for any decent person to listen to. They spoke of the loss of Victoria's plans of university, marriage and children, the pain that has lasted for 26 years and is going nowhere. Graham Hall writes, and I quote, "I miss Victoria every day and will do so for the rest of my life." Perhaps the only thing that can be said in your favour is that you pleaded guilty. Your delaying until almost the day of trial, however, meant that Miss Hall's mother, Lorinda, died in December last year without knowing that her daughter's killer had finally been brought to justice. The nature of a life sentence means the other terms of imprisonment for attempting to kidnap Miss Doherty and kidnapping Miss Hall have to be concurrent. That means totality and double counting between the different counts are not issues. To reflect the attempted kidnap in the total sentence I passed today, I will add an element to the minimum term. Under the Sentencing Council guidelines for kidnapping, I need to assess your culpability and the harm caused, or, by way of Section 63 of the Sentencing Act 2020, that might foreseeably have been caused. Victoria Hall died and Emily Doherty would have done had you been able to carry out your plan. Both were young women, alone at night, and therefore you were deliberately targeting a particularly vulnerable victim. That places both offences in category 1A with a starting point sentence of 11 years and a range of 8 to 16 years. The death of one victim and the prospect of the death of the other would lead me, after a trial, to impose sentences of 14 years for Victoria Hall's kidnap and 10 for Emily Doherty's, the latter reduced as it was an attempt. Your late guilty pleas mean those sentences will be 12 and 9 years imprisonment. Guidance on the imposition of the mandatory life sentence minimum term is set out in Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020. I've considered the decision of the Court of Appeal in the case of Stewart, Cousins, Tustin and Hughes. I will not add to the length of these remarks by rehearsing what's set out with great clarity in that judgment, save to highlight 2 points. First, Schedule 21 must be applied in a flexible, not rigid way to achieve a just result. Second, whole life terms are a sentence of last resort for crimes of the greatest gravity, and if I am in any doubt about imposing such a sentence, a minimum term order is likely to be the correct disposal. These crimes were committed in 1999, which means I have to first consider what the minimum term should be under the modern-day provisions of Schedule 21, then consider if I need to modify that term so as not to exceed that which the Secretary of State would have chosen under the law that was in place in 1999. How far your sentence for the murder of Victoria Hall should be increased because of the 5 later murders is not, legally speaking, straightforward. The Court of Appeal have made clear that those later murders do not, under Schedule 21, mean this crime counts as a, quote, murder by an offender previously convicted of murder, unquote, because you killed Victoria Hall some years before those other victims. See Stewart, Cousins, Tustin, Hughes and Monaghan. I am sure, however, that your situation must be made more serious by those killings, though I must be careful not to elevate this sentence to the extent I am punishing you again for offences that have already led to 5 life sentences. I would regard those crimes as relevant to the task I have to carry out today. And with respect, I have my doubts as to whether a previous decision of the Court of Appeal is properly understood as excluding that conclusion. And as a part of Archibald in the case of Darrigan are the relevant references. The Court of Appeal decision of Ali Adam expresses far more authoritatively than anything I say the same doubt about that understanding of Darrigan, but confirms that later offending can be relevant to the sentencing decision. If, and I stress if, I was just applying Schedule 21, I would have passed a whole life term, given 1, that schedule defines a child as anyone under 18, and the murder of a child involving the abduction of the child would normally be a case for that sentence. That applies here, as Victoria Hall was 17. 2, there is very significant aggravation in the rape or sexual assault of Ms. Hall. 3, she must have experienced mental and physical suffering for some period of time before you killed her, between 1 and 2 hours. 4, there must have been a significant degree of premeditation, given the attempt the night before. 5. Your later conduct, however it is legally characterised, in committing 5 murders in 2006 aggravates your case. 6. There is a need to add to your effective sentence to reflect the attempt to kidnap Emily Doherty the day before. I do not add to it for the kidnap of Miss Hall, as I've already taken that as an aggravating feature of her murder. 7. There may be some slight qualification to treating Victoria Hall as a child, as she was only weeks away from being an adult. And there is definite mitigation in your guilty plea, but those matters are far outweighed by the aggravating factors I have just listed. Do I need to modify that term so as not to exceed that which the Secretary of State would have chosen under the law that was in place in 1999? In my view, I do. I read the Court of Appeal decisions to which I was directed by the prosecution and defence, in particular Sullivan, Gibbs, Eleanor and Eleanor. There are a number of aggravating matters under the guidance at the time, as set out in Lord Bingham's letter to judges, and they are the same as those I have already listed. I am very conscious, however, of the case of In re Taylor, in which Mr. Justice Openshaw, a distinguished judge, hugely experienced in the criminal law, commented that under the old system, quote, whole life terms were reserved for the very few notorious multiple offenders, end of quotation. I conclude that I cannot approach the sentence for the murder in 1999 on the basis I'm punishing a serial killer, as you were not yet that. And there is at least a steer against regarding you as such in Stewart and others, the case I've already referred to. All the aggravating factors I have already listed would have led, under the old rules, to a minimum term slightly above 40 years. But given your late guilty plea, I deduct 1/20, so 40 years is the term I will impose. Even if this was your only life sentence, given your obvious dangerousness and your age, it is extraordinarily unlikely you would ever be released. Given the sentence already imposed for your other dreadful crimes, it is well nigh certain you will die in prison. The sentences I impose are: 1, for the attempted kidnap of Emily Doherty, 9 years imprisonment concurrent; 2, for the kidnap of Victoria Hall, 12 years imprisonment concurrent; 3, for the murder of Victoria Hall, I pass a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. You can go now. You can go now.
And we have just been listening to Justice Benethan there handing down the sentence to Steve Wright, known as the Suffolk Strangler. Now, he pleaded guilty on Monday to the murder and kidnapping of Victoria Hall and then the attempted kidnapping of Emily Doherty. Now, Judge Benethan sentenced him to 9 years for the attempted kidnapping of Emily Doherty, 12 years for the kidnapping of Victoria Hall, and a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years for the murder of Victoria Hall. All of those to be served concurrently. Let's bring in our correspondent, Emma Birchley, who is outside the Old Bailey where that sentence was just handed down. Finally, I mean, decades after the event, we're seeing a sentence.
Yes, indeed. It's been more than 26 years since Vicky Hall disappeared. Her body found 5 days later, 25 miles away. He dumped her body in a ditch. She was left naked, just with her jewellery on. And for years, 26 years, there has been a mystery about who was to blame for that. It was an incredibly difficult time for the community in Felixstowe. Felixstowe. An incredibly difficult time too for Emily Doherty. She was 22 at the time, and just the night before she'd been at the same club that Vicky would go to the following evening. The bandbox was on her way back and was there was an attempted abduction by the man that would turn out to be Steve Wright. This terrifying ordeal as she was followed by him. She'd hide, hear the car going back and forth, the engine would stop, she would then emerge and he was there smiling at her. At one point he loomed over her as she was peering around a corner. This was absolutely terrifying, banging on doors, trying to be let in, and eventually when she was let in, the police were called, but she said she felt she was treated like a silly little girl, that they simply dismissed her. She told details about what had happened. We know that there was not a crime report lodged, and that the police at the time had said she was probably just looking for a lift home. We've also heard in court today that the notebook belonging to the constable who attended that night in September 1999, that notebook had been destroyed in October of 2020, so just after the case into Vicky's disappearance had been reopened. And what we've also heard today is that Emily had given details of a number plate. She'd managed to say 3 characters and later an additional number. Well, if police had really looked into that, it would have brought it down to just 2 vehicles that were registered in the right kind of area, and yet nothing was done. And today in court we've also heard the judge interrupt this morning saying, was it explored that there could have been a connection between what had happened to Emily and what then would happen to Vicky the following day? Had that connection been made in 1999? He said, can I simply ask, has there or will there be an inquiry into what went wrong? And at the end of this morning's session, before the break for lunch and before the sentencing, the prosecutor made it clear that Suffolk Police will be announcing what will be happening in relation to an inquiry into what she called missed opportunities. We're expecting to hear that any time soon. We've heard today details too about exactly what happened to Vicky that following night after the attempted abduction of Emily, how she'd just got 300 metres from home. She'd said goodbye to her friend. There were then screams that the friend heard, but she thought that it was someone just playing about. But neighbours heard a car zooming away. There were skid marks the next day, and the discovery made that she wasn't in her bed in the morning by her family. It would be 5 days later that her body would be found in that ditch. And we've heard as well victim impact statements today. Gemma Algar was the friend who was with Vicky that night. She said she'll never forget that sick feeling in my stomach. I felt something must be desperately wrong. That was when she heard that she hadn't returned home. The grief of knowing she'd never see her again was unbearable once that body had been found. And we heard as well that Vicky's mum only died in December after all this time of uncertainty, knowing that Steve Wright was due to stand trial. He would, as we know, plead guilty on Monday. And Vicky's brother also spoke, read a statement that he'd written, but one on behalf of his father, saying that they miss her every single day. It's the end of the investigation, but it'll never be over for us. Stephen said, the brother, the world has been turned upside down, and it's unbearable pain that Mum died before this case came to a conclusion. So Steve Wright was already serving a whole life order, so spending his whole life in jail for the murders in 2006 of 5 sex workers in Ipswich. It's what gave him the nickname of the Suffolk Strangler. 5 women who died, who, had he been in prison for Vicky's murder, would clearly not have lost their lives. And so today he has been sentenced to a life sentence for Vicky's murder. He will serve a minimum of 40 years, but of course this is a man who is 67 years old. He will die in jail.
And you were mentioning there, Emma, that Steve Wright, of course, already serving a whole life sentence for the murder of those 5 women. Now, that was in and around 2006. And Victoria's murder had actually remained a mystery for 20 years. And then the case was reopened. And I guess that there will be questions as to whether there might be other women that were murdered by Steve Wright that we simply don't know about.
Certainly over the years, there have been a number of links drawn. It was even questioned at one point whether he may have been involved in the Susie Lamplugh case, a long-term unsolved murder. And certainly the police, you would hope, are looking into all possible crimes. The fact is that this remained unsolved for a very, very long time. It was 1999 that Vicky went missing, that Vicky was murdered. It was 2018, so 19 years later, that a cold case review began. It was in 2019 that the case was reopened, and he formally became a suspect about 15 months after that. Then it was in May of 2024 that he was finally charged with murder, and he's had all this opportunity to admit these crimes. He left it until Monday at the start of the trial. When you look at that timeline and you remember that Lorinda, Vicky's mum, died in December, you can see he could have provided her with some answers before her death, and that didn't happen.
And Emma, I just want to remind the viewers that we are waiting for statements by the police and the Crown Prosecution Service there outside the Old Bailey. We'll, of course, take that live as soon as it happens. And now you've also done a very powerful interview, Emma, with Emily Doherty, of course, who was kidnapped, or it was an attempted kidnap by Steve Wright, where she mentioned that when she told police, they treated her, in her words, like a silly little girl. It'll be interesting to see what the police say when they come out to make a statement later on.
Yes, indeed. They talked, didn't they, in court of whether there had been missed opportunities, and there have certainly been, well, there was a question from the judge as whether there will be an inquiry, so we're expecting to hear about that. But you've got to imagine, if you were Emily and you've spent, or she estimated it was around 40 minutes trying to get away from Steve Wright, the utter terror of that. At one point, hiding in a driveway with a stick she'd found. He's driving backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. Then it falls silent. She has to come out at some point. She creeps out, and there he is sitting in the car laughing at her. She's been knocking on doors. No one's answering. And finally, someone does let her in. They're obviously nervous. It's the early hours of the morning, possibly around 4 a.m. I think it was 4:23 when that call went into the police. And yet when the police arrived, they were dismissive and they didn't take what she was saying seriously. There wasn't even a crime report lodged. And then when we hear in court that those details of the number plate that were given, you know, Emily had said there was an H in it. There was an E and an H, and later a 1. Well, that number plate was H141 ELH. And when they whittled it down and looked later at how many cars that could have matched, well, it was initially 56. They whittled it down to 2 that would have been in the right, registered in the right kind of areas. So in the Felixstowe and Trimley areas, and also in the Stowmarket area, which is where Vicky's body was found. And yet nothing was done at the time. It has taken all these years to get a conclusion. And for Emily, well, obviously for Vicky's family, I mean, it has been just incredibly hard. It's changed their lives for good. It changed her friend Gemma Algar's life for good. And for Emily, there's been this whole turmoil for all this time. She talks about suffering this massive survivor's guilt. She tried to say what had happened to her. She had said, I'll come in tomorrow, I'll make a proper statement, and no one did anything. She went off travelling to India the following day. She was away 6 months. When she called home after about a week, was told by her parents that on the landline there was a message to call the police urgently, and there was an hour-long call to Emily, who was in the Himalayas at this point, and she was told that 2 officers may indeed come out there to do an e-fit with her. That never happened. And what's come clear in court today is that the description that Emily gave of her attacker, or the man who tried to abduct her, was very accurate to what Steve Wright looked like at the time. Now, she had said the car was dark blue. It was a burgundy colour, but it was dark. The court it was pointed out that under the street lights, it was the early hours of the morning, it would have been quite hard to tell the colour of the car, but she certainly was able to give a really good steer of what that number plate was, and yet, for whatever reason, those links weren't made at the time. Steve Wright remained a free man. The family didn't know what had happened to their sister, their daughter. Emily was left with all of this uncertainty. And Steve Wright would go on in 2006 to kill 5 women in Ipswich, to become one of the country's most notorious serial killers, never having admitted to any crimes until Monday, where he said, yes, I'm changing my plea, I'm guilty to the attempted kidnap of Emily, to the kidnap and murder of Vicky Hall, for which in total he will he's been given a life sentence to serve a minimum of 40 years, which is purely academic, because this is a man who is already serving a whole life term for his previous crimes, and he's a man who is 67.
And as the judge said, he will die in prison, Steve Wright. Let me just bring those joining us up to speed with the breaking news of the past few minutes. A judge at the Old Bailey, Justice Benethan, has handed down the sentence for Steve Wright. As Emma was mentioning, life with a minimum of 40 years for the murder of Victoria Hall, 12 years for her kidnapping, and 9 years for the attempted kidnapping of Emily Doherty. Let's listen to what Justice Benethan said just a few minutes ago.
All the aggravating factors I have already listed would have led, under the old rules, to a minimum term slightly above 40 years. But given your late guilty plea, I deduct 1/20th, so 40 years is the term I will impose. Even if this was your only life sentence, given your obvious dangerousness and your age, it is extraordinarily unlikely you would ever be released. Given the sentence already imposed for your other dreadful crimes, it is well nigh certain you will die in prison. The sentences I impose are: 1, for the attempted kidnap of Emily Doherty, 9 years imprisonment concurrent; 2, for the kidnap of Victoria Hall, 12 years imprisonment concurrent; 3, for the murder of Victoria Hall, I pass a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. You can go now.
Justice Benethan handing down his sentence a little earlier, and we are waiting for statements from the police and the Crown Prosecution Service any time now. In the meantime, let's speak to Emma Birchley, who's been following this case and is also outside the Old Bailey. And we heard there from the judge that due to Steve Wright's obvious danger and age, he will die in prison.
Yes, I mean, this was a man that already had a whole life term for the murder of 5 women. In 2006, he was sentenced 2 years after that. It's been very powerful in court this morning, hearing from those who've been impacted by his actions in this case. We've heard first off from a very tearful Gemma Algar, the best friend of Vicky. They were absolutely best mates at school. They'd spent all their time together. They'd been out that night. They'd separated just 300 metres from Vicky Hall's home. And it was as she was walking away that Gemma thought she heard screams, but thought it might have been just someone messing around. And then that dreadful news in the morning when she's called to find out what happened, and she said, "I'll never forget that sick feeling in my stomach. I felt something must be desperately wrong. And then to find out 5 days later that her best friend's body has been found in a ditch. She said the grief of knowing she would never see her again was unbearable. And I think this is a really powerful moment. She said, she spoke of the fear that that person might come for her as well. Her life was turned upside down. She's replayed countless if-onlys and what-ifs. You can imagine that, can't you? Leaving her friend never makes it home and is murdered. And we heard too from Vicky's brother Stephen, who read a statement first on behalf of his father Graham, who says he misses her every single day. It might be the end of the investigation, but it'll never be over for us. And Stephen reading his own statement saying, our family was forced into an exclusive club no one wants to be part of. Our world was turned upside down. And he spoke too of the unbearable pain that his mum died before this came to a conclusion. She died in December, 26 years after her 17-year-old daughter never made it back from a night out in a club in Felixstowe. So you get a sense of just how much this has impacted people and how, yes, there is a conclusion. Yes, a man has been sentenced. He'll serve a minimum of 40 years for the murder, although, of course, he's already serving a whole life term for those previous 5 killings. But for those who were affected, and that includes Gemma and the family, but also Emily, you know, this lasts forever. A sentence doesn't really change anything.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the killing of Victoria Hall, the murder in 1999. That's when the attempted kidnap of Emily Doherty happened as well. But then, of course, the murder of 5 women in and around Ipswich in 2006. We can see, we were looking at live pictures outside the Old Bailey a little earlier. We are waiting to hear from Suffolk Police and the Crown Prosecution Service. It'll be interesting to see what Suffolk Police say, because, of course, you know, the timing, the question always is, could some of these murders have been avoided? What have Suffolk Police been saying prior to the sentencing?
Well, they haven't really commented yet. They were waiting until the end of the sentencing to do that. And during the hearing this morning, when the Crown was outlining the case, they were interrupted by Judge Benathan, who questioned if it had been explored that there was a connection back in 1999 between Emily's attempted abduction and then the kidnap and murder of Vicky. He said, can I simply ask, has there or will there be an inquiry into what went wrong? And actually, as the morning session was closing, the prosecutor did say that Suffolk Police would be announcing what would happen in regards to an inquiry about what they called, she called, missed opportunities, because certainly when you hear from Emily, when you hear about how she feels, she was dismissed, she just simply wasn't taken seriously. You do get the sense that opportunities were missed, and there are certainly questions to answer about why no crime was lodged that night, why the notebook from the officer who attended that day in September 1999, why it's been recorded that that notebook was destroyed in 2020, and that was not long after the case had been reopened in 2019, so that 20 years after Vicky had gone missing and was murdered. And it would only be June 2020 that actually Steve Wright became a formal suspect in this case, then charged in May of 2024. And it's taken some time, like these things do, to come to court. He took it all the way to the wire, right away up to day 1 of the trial here at the Old Bailey, before saying, yeah, I did it. You know, this is a mystery that has plagued the people, the families, the loved ones for so many years. 26 and a half years it's been since Vicky went missing, just 17 years old, as she walked home from a night out. And now, after all this time, he has admitted it. And in fact, the first crimes that he has ever admitted, because of course he went to trial for the murders of those 5 sex workers in Ipswich who all died at the end of 2006. He pleaded not guilty to those, so they had to go through a full trial. And you imagine being the friends and family of those 5 women who died. I mean, how must they be feeling now that had Steve Wright been caught back in 1999 or in any of the 6-7 years that followed, then their loved ones may well be alive today. So there are, as Gemma Algar, Vicky's friend, said, so many ifs and buts, so many what ifs that exist, that people will want answers to. And at least now Steve Wright, we know, has pleaded guilty. They will know who was behind these crimes. But the fact is, he was on the streets for many more years than he might have been had he been caught. And those 5 women who lost their lives, who were picked up in the red light district, who he would then murder, dumping their bodies in rural locations around the Ipswich area, those women would still be alive.
Absolutely, and most of those women disappeared, or their bodies were found towards the end of 2006. And as you mentioned, Steve Wright denied the charges once he was arrested, but was still given a whole life jail term when he was convicted in February 2008. It was a very, very high-profile case, of course, earning him the nickname the Suffolk Strangler. Tell us a little bit more about that and the impact that that case had all those years ago.
Well, it really, had an enormous impact. Of course, this had national coverage and global, in fact. But I'm from that area, and it was immense. The uncertainty, the fear that people had at not knowing what was happening. There was clearly a killer out there, this enormous attention from the world, and more bodies would turn up, and there was this sense of when this would end. And of course he was eventually arrested, but not for some time. And by that point, as we know, 5 young women had been killed, their bodies left in rural locations, all women who worked as sex workers. Steve Wright lived at the time right in the red light district of Ipswich. He was known to use prostitutes, and they were people that he obviously targeted. And I think possibly that was part of the problem. When you think that Vicky Hall was a 17-year-old girl, she was looking forward to her upcoming 18th birthday. She was studying for her A-level. She was planning to go to university. She wasn't the same kind of category, if you want to say that, as the women who died in 2006, and yet their bodies were all found in very similar kind of locations. They were all naked, jewellery still on. And yet it took so many years for the case to be reopened. That cold case review in 2018, the reopening of the case in 2019, Steve Wright becoming a formal suspect in 2020, finally being charged in 2024. They clearly didn't want to make another mistake when it came to Vicky Hall, because someone had stood trial. Clearly they were not the right person, and all the time Steve Wright was out there, still on the streets, and as we know, in 2006 murdering those 5 women, being nicknamed in the newspapers the Suffolk Strangler, given that whole life term for his crimes in February of 2008, and the family waiting and waiting, the family of Vicky Hall, for their own answers to what had happened to their own loved ones. That finally coming on Monday when Steve Wright changed his plea suddenly in court, said, "I'm guilty to her kidnap and murder, and guilty too to the attempted abduction of Emily Doherty, who for all of those years, she's questioned herself. You know, she had explained what had happened to her to the police. No one took her seriously. No one listened to what she had to say. She said she felt like she was treated like a silly little girl, and it has plagued her. She's had this survivor's guilt. When she heard that Vicky had gone missing just the next day, she felt sure it had to be the same person who was responsible for both crimes, and yet nothing seemed to happen. And in fact, she told me when I was speaking to her that she did contact the police, she says, around 2002 and 3 or 2013. In fact, this is my report after speaking at length to Emily about what she went through all those years ago and how she's been suffering ever since.
I bricked it. I pegged it. In that instance, I knew my life was in danger.
Emily Doherty has never spoken about the night she was almost abducted by a man who would become a serial killer, and the police, she said, didn't take her seriously. But the very next day, 17-year-old Victoria Hall was kidnapped just a couple of miles along the road, and her body then dumped in a ditch. That man's name was Steve Wright, now known as one of the country's most notorious serial killers, nicknamed the Suffolk Strangler.
I thought that must be him. It can't be a coincidence. The next night, someone else.
It was the early hours of September the 18th, 1999. Emily was walking home from a club with her husband and another couple, but the two women ended up way ahead. Her friend said she had to go, and Emily was left alone.
I remember the first instance I saw him. The door was open. The engine was running and he was standing by the car. He saw me and I saw him.
She ran.
I jumped over a wall and knocked on someone's door and said, "Let me in." But no one answered.
Petrified, Emily kept running and got down on all fours to peer around the corner to see if he'd gone.
Suddenly, he was literally right there. He stepped right into me. He said, "All right," in a low, sleazy way. In that instance, I knew my life was in danger. I just knew. The adrenaline kicked in.
She sprinted away, and this time a couple did answer the door and called 999. But she says she didn't get the response she expected.
The police came, but they didn't believe me at all.
She says she gave them at least some of the number plate and offered to give a statement later the same day.
They said that won't be necessary. Forget about it. I really felt like they didn't take me seriously at all. They treated me like a silly little girl.
The next day, Emily left to go travelling in India, but when she rang home, there was a message asking her to call the police urgently. The manhunt was already underway for Vicky Hall's killer, her body having been found 25 miles away. 5 days after disappearing from the same club in Felixstowe that Emily had been at the night before. Emily did give a statement over the phone from the Himalayas.
That was the last I ever heard about it.
In 2006, 7 years later, that same killer, still walking the streets, would murder 5 sex workers he'd picked up in Ipswich's red light district. Their bodies were found in rural locations, just like Vicky's had been. Steve Wright, who denied the charges, was given a whole life jail term. Vicky's murder had remained a mystery, but 20 years on, the case was reopened and eventually Wright would be charged with killing her too. At the start of his trial at the Old Bailey, he finally changed his plea to guilty, admitting murdering Vicky and attempting to abduct Emily.
You can't help thinking, if they had taken me seriously, Vicky would have survived. But certainly if they had found him sooner, the 5 other women might still be here.
Live shot there outside the Old Bailey, where we are waiting for a statement by Suffolk Police. We've just had a statement in from the Crown Prosecution Service, Samantha Woolley. She said justice has finally been achieved for Victoria Hall after 26 years. The meticulous work we have carried out with Suffolk Police, supporting their investigation and working hard to bring this case to court, has resulted in Wright admitting his guilt. Our case was bolstered by critical DNA evidence made possible because of pioneering new forensic techniques, along with a wealth of other evidence which gave him little choice. Let's listen in now.
It won't bring her back, but it will finish the police inquiries and the case being revisited. Unfortunately, my wife Lorinda has not lived to see this day, but she did know that it probably was Steve Wright. Victoria was a loving girl with a whole life before her, with plans of what she wanted to achieve. All this was snatched away from her by Steve Wright. We lost our lovely daughter, sister, niece, granddaughter, have endured 26 years of hell, which will continue from today onwards and forever. We thank the Suffolk Police for their time and resources spent on this case, especially DCI Caroline Miller, who is the DCI who reopened the case 7 years ago. Her care, tenacity and determination to find answers was amazing, and also to the other SIOs who have followed her, finishing with DCI Matt Connick, who has closed the case and showed care and understanding over the last couple of years. Thank you to them. Also to our son Stephen for his continued support and love, and of course our family liaison officers, especially DC Beck Gooch, who has been with us since day one in 1999. What an amazing job she has done. A wonderful person who has always looked after us and making sure we knew what was happening with the case. And finally, our final FLO, DCI Miranda Cliff, who for the last couple of years has supported Beck, and we couldn't have got through without them. Thank you.
Graham, do you take any questions?
No.
Sorry?
No.
How do you feel about the police's response?
No.
Are you
The father there and the family of Victoria Hall, and Steve Wright has, of course, been sentenced to life with a minimum of 40 years for her murder back in 1999. The father there mentioning that she had been snatched away by Steve Wright. She'd been a lovely daughter, niece and sister, and that the family had been living 26 years of hell. Let's go back to Emma Birchley, who is outside the Old Bailey. And Emma, we are still waiting for the Crown Prosecution Service. Actually, I think the police, Suffolk Police, is speaking now. Let's listen.
And painstaking murder investigation. 26 years ago, Victoria Hall was just 2 weeks away from her 18th birthday and had her whole life ahead of her. This was cut short so cruelly. This appalling crime had a profound impact on Victoria's family and friends, along with communities in Felixstowe, Trimley St Mary, Creeting St Peter and across Suffolk. I wish to pay tribute to Victoria's father, Graham, and her brother, Stephen, who now finally know who is accountable for these shocking actions. This demonstrates that time is no barrier to justice. Special mention must be given to Emily, at the time a 22-year-old woman, who narrowly escaped the depraved actions of this man the night before Victoria was taken. We do not understand the impact, or we do not underestimate the impact that this night has had on her and continues to do so. I'm glad we've been able to provide answers and a sense of justice being delivered. Whilst this was a guilty plea, this was not an early guilty plea. Steve Wright made significant attempts to cover his tracks after the offence. He was interviewed twice by police over the course of 2 years, whilst the investigation developed, and was in the court system for 21 months with legal hearings challenging the evidence. He was forced into a position where he had no alternative but to plead guilty to all 3 offences with the weight of evidence against him. This has been a complex re-investigation spanning over 7 years. I want to thank the officers and staff who have worked tirelessly on this investigation to develop and present all the evidence in this case. Their persistence is the reason for this result. I wish to thank the commitment of Cellmark Forensic Services, who have worked on the investigation for the last 5 years, testing and retesting exhibits and pushing the boundaries of latest DNA techniques to deliver significant evidence about the man responsible for this murder. The police team have worked closely with the Crown Prosecution Service over several years, presenting a compelling case, and we are grateful for the expertise of Specialist Prosecutor Sam Woolley, Miss Ledwood, King's Counsel, and Miss Blair. To all the witnesses who were prepared to attend court to give evidence at trial, despite the passage of time, and to all those who provided information to assist the police inquiry since 1999, thank you. This was always about Victoria Hall and her family. They have been front and centre and a consistent source of motivation to the police investigation team. They have shown strength, courage, dignity and support to the investigation team, and our thoughts remain with them today and for the time ahead.
This iconic. Have you failed the women by not carrying and catching them earlier?
DCI Matthew Connick there speaking for Suffolk Police, talking there about a sense of justice being delivered. Let's go back to the Old Bailey. I believe that's the Crown Prosecution Service.
My name is Samantha Woolley, and I'm a specialist prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution. Sorry. Shall I start again? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Samantha Woolley, and I'm a specialist prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service. Firstly, on behalf of the CPS, I would like to pay tribute to the late Victoria Hall, for whom justice has finally come after 26 years. Much attention will be made of Steve Wright being convicted of another murder, attention he will likely enjoy but does not deserve. The strength of our case, which featured a wealth of evidence, gave him little option but to admit his guilt. Quite simply, he represents the very worst of humanity and is exactly where he belongs, in prison. There are two tests we must meet before prosecuting someone. Firstly, that there is sufficient evidence, and secondly, whether it is in the public interest to do so. Was it in the public interest to prosecute a man who was already serving a whole life order for crimes committed over 20 years ago? The answer to that is a resounding yes. Justice for Victoria demanded nothing less. The hard work of Suffolk Police since the restarting of this investigation in 2019, which I have supported since the early 2020, along with fellow colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service, has resulted in justice now being served. Our message could not be clearer. We will relentlessly pursue justice for victims and families, no matter how many years or decades have passed. Time is no barrier. Our thoughts today remain with those who loved and cherished Victoria, and with everyone whose lives have been affected by that devastating loss. We also hold in mind Emily Doherty and her family, who continue to feel the impact of her ordeal. We stand with each of them in this incredibly difficult time. Thank you.
That was Samantha Woolley, Special Prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service, saying that the justice had finally been achieved for Victoria Hall after 26 years, and the strength of their case meant that Steve Wright had no option really but to plead guilty. Let's go to Emma Birchley, who's also outside the Old Bailey and has been following the case. We've heard from both Suffolk Police and the Crown Prosecution Service there. What did you make of it, Emma?
Well, they're clearly pleased that they've finally got a result in this case, but we thought we might hear if there was going to be an inquiry into missed opportunities, and that, from what I was hearing, certainly didn't come. We had heard in court the judge saying that, or questioning whether it had been explored by the police in 1999, that there may have been a connection between the attempted abduction of Emily and then the kidnap and murder of Vicky the next day. And he'd also asked whether there may be an inquiry. He said, can I simply ask, has there or will there be an inquiry into what went wrong. And at the end of this morning's session, there'd been a suggestion from the prosecution that we'd be hearing from Suffolk Police about what may happen with regards to an inquiry into what she called missed opportunities. But I certainly didn't hear anything on that. We heard, though, from Vicky's father now in court, the victim impact statement. His victim impact statement had been read by Vicky's brother, Stephen. In this case, we heard from Graham. He talked about having endured the family having endured 26 years of hell, which will continue from today onwards and forever. He said that although Lorinda, Vicky's mum, died in December, she was pretty sure that it was Steve Wright. So that at least is something, that sense that she felt that they knew who was behind the murder of Vicky, the daughter, all those years ago, back in 1999. But of course, it was in May of 2024 that he would finally be charged with the crimes, yet would only on Monday plead guilty to them on day one of the trial here. And I think it's interesting, you know, we've talked about missed opportunities back in 1999, missed opportunities from the complaint made by Emily Doherty, her report of having been chased, that terrifying ordeal of hiding, hearing the car going backwards and forwards, a car stopping, thinking, OK, maybe I'm safe, appearing, and there he was still, and at one point looming over her, saying, all right, before she then ran off, you know, jumping over walls, banging on doors, and finally getting into a house and feeling like the police treated her as a silly little girl. Well, interestingly, that may be the case here, and we've talked about those potential missed opportunities, but interestingly, Vicky's father, Graham, clearly with a lot of praise for the police now. He talked about the care, tenacity and determination to get answers from the senior investigating officer who began this, Caroline Miller. This was a cold case review she looked at in 2018, and then in 2019 the decision made to continue to pursue this, for the investigation to be reopened into this unsolved crime, with Steve Wright formally becoming a suspect the following year and then being charged, as we know, in 2024. This, a man who, for 7 years after the kidnap and murder of that 17-year-old girl, had continued to walk the streets, but who, at the end of 2006, would then go on that killing spree, killing 5 women that he knew from the red light district, sex workers, killing them, dumping their bodies in various rural locations and pleading not guilty to those crimes. He would then stand trial in February of 2008. At that point, he was given a whole life term. So today's sentence today, really purely academic, but told that he will serve a minimum of 40 years for the murder of Vicky Hall.
Emma Birchley outside the Old Bailey, where that sentence has been handed down. Emma, thank you. And good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. Breaking news within the last hour. Steve Wright, the Suffolk Strangler, has been sentenced to at least 40 years in prison over the kidnap and murder of 17-year-old Victoria Hall in Suffolk in 1999. He was also sentenced for the attempted kidnapping of 22-year-old Emily Doherty the night before he murdered Victoria Hall. Well, Victoria was snatched on September 17th, 1999, after a night out with her friend Gemma Algar at the Bandbox nightclub in Felixstowe. Prosecutors said her friend heard 2 high-pitched female screams after the pair had separated as Victoria was snatched and bundled into Wright's car. Well, Wright was already serving a whole life term for the murders of 5 other women back in 2006. Until now, he had never admitted to any of his killings, and during the sentencing, he was told he will now die in prison. Well, after Steve Wright was sentenced, Victoria Hall's father, Graham Hall, spoke to reporters outside court.
Today, we finally have justice for our Victoria. It won't bring her back, but it will finish the police inquiries and the case being revisited. Unfortunately, my wife, Lorinda, has not lived to see this day, but she did know that it probably was Steve Wright. Victoria was a loving girl with a whole life before her, with plans of what she wanted to achieve. All this was snatched away from her by Steve Wright. We lost our lovely daughter, sister, niece, granddaughter, have endured 26 years of hell, which will continue from today onwards and forever. We thank the Suffolk Police for their time and resources spent on this case, especially DCI Caroline Miller, who is the DCI who reopened the case 7 years ago. Her care, tenacity and determination to find answers was amazing, and also to the other SIOs who have followed her, finishing with DCI Matt Connick, who has closed the case and showed care and understanding over the last couple of years. Thank you to them. Also to our son Stephen for his continued support and love, and of course our family liaison officers, especially DC Beck Gooch, who has been with us since day one in 1999. What an amazing job she has done. A wonderful person who has always looked after us and making sure we knew what was happening with the case. And finally, our final FLO, DCI Miranda Cliff, who for the last couple of years has supported Beck, and we couldn't have got through without them. Thank you.
Graham Hall, the father of Victoria Hall, speaking outside the Old Bailey a little earlier, saying that the family had lived 26 years of hell since her murder. Well, also speaking outside the Old Bailey in the last hour was Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Connick from Suffolk Police.
Today's sentencing marks the conclusion to an extensive and painstaking murder investigation. 26 years ago, Victoria Hall was just 2 weeks away from her 18th birthday and had her whole life ahead of her. This was cut short so cruelly. This appalling crime had a profound impact on Victoria's family and friends, along with communities in Felixstowe, Trimley St Mary, Creeting St Peter and across Suffolk. I wish to pay tribute to Victoria's father, Graham, and her brother, Stephen, who now finally know who is accountable for these shocking actions. This demonstrates that time is no barrier to justice. Special mention must be given to Emily, at the time a 22-year-old woman, who narrowly escaped the depraved actions of this man the night before Victoria was taken. We do not understand the impact, or we do not underestimate the impact that this night has had on her and continues to do so. I'm glad we've been able to provide answers and a sense of justice being delivered. Whilst this was a guilty plea, this was not an early guilty plea. Steve Wright made significant attempts to cover his tracks after the offence. He was interviewed twice by police over the course of 2 years, whilst the investigation developed, and was in the court system for 21 months with legal hearings challenging the evidence. He was forced into a position where he had no alternative but to plead guilty to all 3 offences with the weight of evidence against him. This has been a complex re-investigation spanning over 7 years. I want to thank the officers and staff who have worked tirelessly on this investigation to develop and present all the evidence in this case. Their persistence is the reason for this result. I wish to thank the commitment of Cellmark Forensic Services, who have worked on the investigation for the last 5 years, testing and retesting exhibits and pushing the boundaries of latest DNA techniques to deliver significant evidence about the man responsible for this murder. The police team have worked closely with the Crown Prosecution Service over several years, presenting a compelling case, and we are grateful for the expertise of Specialist Prosecutor Sam Woolley, Miss Ledwood, King's Counsel and Miss Blair. To all the witnesses who were prepared to attend court to give evidence at trial despite the passage of time, and to all those who provided information to assist the police inquiry since 1999, thank you. This was always about Victoria Hall and her family. They have been front and centre and a consistent source of motivation to the police investigation team. They have shown strength, courage, dignity and support to the investigation team, and our thoughts remain with them today and for the time ahead.
That was Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Connick from Suffolk Police, also paying tribute to the family of Victoria Hall, her father Graham and brother Stephen, for their tenacity, and also saying that time is no barrier to justice. And this is what Samantha Woolley, who's the special prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service, told reporters outside court following that 40-year sentence given to Steve Wright.
Good afternoon. My name is Samantha Woolley and I'm a specialist prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service. Firstly, on behalf of the CPS, I would like to pay tribute to the late Victoria Hall, for whom justice has finally come after 26 years. Much attention will be made of Steve Wright being convicted of another murder, attention he will likely enjoy but does not deserve. The strength of our case, which featured a wealth of evidence, gave him little option but to admit his guilt. Quite simply, he represents the very worst of humanity and is exactly where he belongs, in prison. There are two tests we must meet before prosecuting someone. Firstly, that there is sufficient evidence, and secondly, whether it is in the public interest to do so. Was it in the public interest to prosecute a man who was already serving a whole life order for crimes committed over 20 years ago? The answer to that is a resounding yes. Justice for Victoria demanded nothing less. The hard work of Suffolk Police since the restarting of this investigation in 2019, which I have supported since the early 2020, along with fellow colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service, has resulted in justice now being served. Our message could not be clearer. We will relentlessly pursue justice for victims and families, no matter how many years or decades have passed. Time is no barrier. Our thoughts today remain with those who loved and cherished Victoria, and with everyone whose lives have been affected by that devastating loss. We also hold in mind Emily Doherty and her family, who continue to feel the impact of her ordeal. We stand with each of them in this incredibly difficult time. Thank you.
Samantha Woolley there from the Crown Prosecution Service, and this was the moment the sentence was handed down to Steve Wright.
You are 67 years old. You are already serving a life sentence with a whole life order for 5 other murders of young women. The terms of imprisonment that I impose today will almost certainly make no difference. In the small hours of Saturday, the 18th of February, 1999, in Felixstowe, Emily Doherty had been out clubbing, but ended up separated from her friends and her husband. So she set off to walk back to where she was staying. You tried to kidnap her, but she was too alert and too quick and escaped, managing to rouse a couple by banging on their front door, who then called the police. I am sure that if you had managed to abduct her, you would have killed her. That is a dreadful thing to conclude, but I do so based on what you did the next night, what you did in 2006, and on the simple fact that Miss Doherty had seen your face and your car's number plate. So there is no way you would have set her free to have you arrested. That same Saturday, the 18th of September, Victoria Hall went to her part-time job, then came home and got dressed up, ready to go out. She left her home in Trimley St Mary, just by Felixstowe, about 9 p.m, and met with her friend Gemma Alga. The two of them went to the Bandbox nightclub in Felixstowe. They had a drink, they danced with each other, and at 1 a.m. they left. They went and got chips near the seafront and then set off to walk home, singing as they went. They parted company quite close to their homes at about 2:20, and that was the last time anybody, apart from you, saw Victoria Hall alive. Perhaps the only thing that can be said in your favour is that you pleaded guilty. Your delaying until almost the day of trial, however, meant that Miss Hall's mother, Lorinda, died in December last year without knowing that her daughter's killer had finally been brought to justice. All the aggravating factors I have already listed would have led, under the old rules, to a minimum term slightly above 40 years. But given your late guilty plea, I deduct 1/20th, so 40 years is the term I will impose. Even if this was your only life sentence, given your obvious dangerousness and your age, it is extraordinarily unlikely you would ever be released. Given the sentence already imposed for your other dreadful crimes, it is well nigh certain you will die in prison.
And let's bring in our correspondent, Emma Birchley, who is outside the Old Bailey. And Emma, we were just listening to Justice Benethan as he handed down his sentence for Steve Wright. And of course, we were reminded that Steve Wright was already serving a life sentence. And a little earlier, Samantha Woolley from the Crown Prosecution Service said that one of the questions was whether it was in the public interest for someone who's already serving a life sentence to go through another trial. And she said that it absolutely was, because it brought justice, didn't it, for Victoria Hall?
Yeah, there have been so many people who've been desperate for answers, for Vicky's family, for her friends, from Gemma Algar, who was the school friend that she was with that night, for Emily, who is the woman who just the night before had had this horrific ordeal where Steve Wright was stalking her around these residential streets of Felixstowe. So yes, that is why this case needed to come to court. But of course, you know, the fact remains that Vicky is not here. And for 26 years, in fact, just over 26 years, Stephen Hall hasn't had a sister, Graham Hall hasn't had a daughter, and Lorinda Hall, the mum, died in December. Now, we heard from Graham, and he said, well, his wife felt pretty sure that Steve Wright was the man who was responsible for killing Vicky. But the fact is she was not around anymore, dying in December, to actually hear it for herself. And in fact, it was in May 2024 that Steve Wright was charged with the murder, but it was only on Monday of day one of the trial here at the Old Bailey that he admitted kidnapping her and killing her, that he admitted attempting to abduct Emily the night before. And this, of course, was back in 1999. Now, Steve Wright has been in jail since 2008 because in 2006 he murdered 5 women. They were sex workers he'd met in the red light district of Ipswich. And he had pleaded not guilty to those crimes, but he was found to be responsible for them. He was sentenced to a whole life term, so we knew whatever the result today, it didn't really in the end make a difference to how long he'll be in jail. He was already going to die in jail. But for those involved in this case to actually hear what sentence he would get was really important. And so for Steve Wright, for the murder and kidnap, or for the murder of Vicky Hall, a life sentence with the minimum term of 40 years in all. He also got 9 years actually for attempting to kidnap Emily and 12 for the kidnap of Vicky. But as I said, really purely academic. This is a man who will die in jail. Interestingly, what we haven't talked about is his demeanour in court. He was wearing glasses. He had them off actually at the start of sentencing, put them on to look closely at the judge. But when he'd arrived in court in the morning in this grey tracksuit, he sat with his arms crossed. It was almost as if he had a smirk on his face in Court 10 here at the Old Bailey. And I looked over at him as he stood up as the judge came in. It's what you do in court, you stand up as part of the process. And I thought I saw a smile on his face. So you can imagine what that was like for the family who were there in court, and too for Gemma Algar, who was the school friend that was with Vicky that night. in September of 1999. They'd been out to a club in Felixstowe called the Bandbox. They were the best of friends at school, out of school, talking on the phone all the time. They'd actually parted ways 300 metres away from Vicky's home. It's thought that Steve Wright kidnapped her as she was in this very short alleyway. The family woke up in the morning. Vicky wasn't there. They called Gemma, and Gemma in court in her victim impact statement said, "I will never forget that sick feeling in my stomach. I felt something must be desperately wrong." And then when the discovery was made 5 days later by a dog walker of Vicky's body in a ditch, she was 4-foot deep ditch, she was naked, facing up with just jewellery on. She said when that news emerged, the grief of knowing she'd never see her again was unbearable, and she lived with the fear that that same person might come for me, she said. She's replayed countless if-onlys and what-ifs. You can imagine what's that's been like for her as the friend who was there that night, who actually heard 2 screams, but actually dismissed it as someone messing around. That was the kind of thing that she thought she could have heard in that estate, and actually neighbours there heard the screams, they heard the car speeding off. Skid marks were described as having been seen the next day. And in court, we actually heard a statement from Vicky's brother too, Stephen. He was 15 at the time, and he says, "Our family was forced into an exclusive club no one wants to be part of." He talked about their world being turned upside down, the unbearable pain that his mum had died before she knew for sure that Steve Wright was the man responsible for this crime. He described what's happened to them as a family as a life sentence, but at least now they know for sure that Steve Wright, the man who in 2006 had murdered 5 women, 5 sex workers in Ipswich, that same man had been responsible for the murder of Vicky 7 years before that. But of course now there are questions to be answered when we hear that just a day before Vicky was kidnapped, Emily had been through an ordeal where he'd stalked her, where she'd managed to get away. This terrifying ordeal that she'd had to go through, that she managed to get someone finally to open a door. It was about 4 in the morning. You can imagine how scary it would have been for them. And when they finally let them in, the woman in that house said she felt that the police were pretty dismissive of Emily, and she heard an officer saying, oh, that she probably just wanted a lift home. There wasn't even a crime report lodged, and the court was also told that in October of 2020, so this is a year after the investigation was reopened, it has been recorded that the notepad of that constable who attended that house had been destroyed. So there had been mention today by the prosecution that Suffolk police are likely to say at some point soon whether there will be an inquiry. Certainly that was something the judge was questioning, whether there had been an inquiry, whether there would be an inquiry. We're expecting to hear that sometime soon. And I know, I've been in touch with Emily, I know that is something that she would very much welcome, as I'm sure the family would. Although, interestingly, the family, the father, Graham, making it very clear here outside the Old Bailey that actually the officers that have dealt with him and the family in recent years since that case has been reopened have been nothing but supportive.
Yes, we did hear very warm words there from the father, Graham Hall. If you look at the dates, again, the murder of Victoria Hall, 1999, and the murders of the other 5 women, 2006. I mean, in truth is, we don't really know if there are more women or other families who, in the words of, I think, the brother, Stephen Hall, are part of this club that no one wants to be a part of.
Yeah, and you imagine if you are the loved one of someone who has been murdered, someone who has gone missing, wondering if Steve Wright could be behind those crimes too. And actually over the years, a number of names have been linked. For example, a really notorious case, the disappearance of Susie Lamplugh. It's been reported that Steve Wright and Susie Lamplugh worked together on the QE2 cruise ship. But at the time, well, when the police looked into this, there weren't enough leads to really go on. But there have been various other crimes over the years that have been linked, and that sense of uncertainty, but maybe of hope too, because of course, for Vicky's family, we're 26 plus years on. And finally, they do have answers. Finally, they know for sure that Steve Wright was the man who kidnapped and then killed Vicky, a 17-year-old girl, doing her A-levels, planning to go off to university. All of that taken away from her. And that's what we heard in court from the family. You know, that real loss, no career, no marriage, no kids. And for Graham, no grandchildren, you know, those all taken away with Vicky's death.
Absolutely. It was a very touching testimony there from her father. Emma Birchley, outside the Old Bailey where that sentence has been handed down, been following the case for us. Emma, for the moment, thank you.